From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Democratic National Convention opens in Chicago with a speech expected tonight in prime time from President Biden as anti-Israel protesters are already on the march. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Colin Levy here in the Windy City, which will be particularly windy this week starting tonight with speeches from Joe and Jill Biden, then President Obama tomorrow, Vice Presidential nominee Tim Walz on Wednesday, and then on Thursday, the main event, Kamala Harris's acceptance speech Thursday night. Sprinkled in among that, of course, will be speeches by Democratic up-and-comers, along with party business, caucus meetings, and so forth. Kim, you have been covering conventions for a while now. What do you expect from this one here this week in Chicago?
If you look at the themes that the Democratic National Committee have set out, so the broad title for the conference is For the People, for Our Future. And just as the Republicans did, they have a different theme every night of the week, Monday through Thursday. It's going to be interesting. The general feel here is very much a Kamala Harris catchword, which is the future, the future, the future. But what they're going to do tonight on Monday is, first of all, they're going to deal with the problem of Joe Biden, which is to roll him out and then get him out of the way. And, it really is quite a remarkable thing. This is the current president of the United States, and he's speaking on the first night, which is normally the night reserved for third-tier people. They kind of ramp up as you go along. You would expect him to speak the night before or maybe even introduce Kamala Harris on the final night. No, they are so worried about his performance, so they're going to roll him out this evening and then forget he ever existed. And they're trying to make it sound a little bit better by saying that Monday night is all devoted to the extraordinary accomplishments. We'll see if they get away with that. We haven't got much from her an agenda, so it's going to be a bit fuzzy. It's going to be, look at all the amazing stuff we've done. Trust us, we'll continue to do better as we go forward.
A couple thoughts on Joe Biden's speech tonight. One, I guess from the audience's perspective, one question is how he looks, how he performs, what he says about his decision to abruptly leave the 2024 campaign. He did a recent interview with CBS, his first since pulling out of the race, and he was repeating his line that in that debate, he had a bad day. It was a bad debate. He seems to think that he could still have won the 2024 election, but he was trying to save his party from divisions. He said that if I had stayed, the interviewer would be asking him why he was being criticized by Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats. Two is it's a moment to reflect, I guess, on Biden's legacy as a president. Now we know a one-term president. Colin, what do you make of President Biden's legacy as we sit here today now, almost 4 years after he took office, and what he has accomplished or not in that time?
Yeah, I think the real shame of Joe Biden's legacy is the fact that he had the opportunity to govern as a centrist, more in that sort of old school Bill Clinton model. And if he'd done that, he really did have an opportunity back then to pull the country out of some of this polarization tailspin that we've been in. People elected him for the same reason they elected Jimmy Carter. They just kind of wanted a bland and unobjectionable leader to kind of give them a break from the political madness. But that obviously didn't happen. That's not how he governed at all. Because I think the problem with Joe Biden on an intrinsic personality level is that he's just always been more of a pleaser than a leader. So he's more inclined to just give the party what it wants instead of following his own guiding lights. That's on a policy level what caused the leftward swing on issues like border security and certainly with the COVID spending relief that goosed the economy and sent us into this period of crazy inflation. So I think the party is now really dealing with the fallout from that.
Kim, what's your take on this? One thing that I think is worth remembering is that President Biden ran as a uniter, saying he would bring the country together. And part of what may have changed his mind is winning control of the Senate in those two Georgia Senate runoffs in 2021. It's easy to imagine that Joe Biden expected that at least in his first 2 years in the White House, he was going to be dealing with a Congress that was was at least half controlled by Republicans. And that did not turn out to be the case. Democrats won those Senate seats with an assist, I think, from Donald Trump, who was still raging about voter fraud and telling people that their votes wouldn't count. And so Republicans lost those two Senate runoffs, which was a pretty expensive proposition. But I think that changed the Biden mentality in the White House, getting unified control of government in this 50-50 Senate with Kamala Harris as a tiebreaker. And then you started seeing stories about the historians coming in telling Biden that you could be the next FDR. And he does seem to have internalized that and tried to do that. And that leads, I think, to even some of the things he's proposing lately, like this Supreme Court term limits reform plan. One of the juxtapositions, I think, from him lately is he's been talking about how Democrats need to beat Donald Trump in order to save democracy. But I think there are many listeners who hear that message and think, wait a second, aren't you the guy who's trying to restructure the Supreme Court? And isn't your party the one who's talking about nuking the Senate filibuster and changing the democratic institutions that Americans have lived with for a long time now?
I agree that winning the Congress certainly turbocharged him, although I'd argue the deck was stacked in that direction anyway. It allowed him to do more. But one of the great fictions of Joe Biden is that if you look at what he did in the 2020 campaign, while he preached comedy and said he wanted to be a uniter, and he made his campaign very much about settling the country down after COVID, it was a very radical agenda. And that speaks to a Democratic Party that, if you step back, for about 15 years has had this growing split inside it between mainstream Democrats, as it were, and progressives that are much louder. And at the end of that 2020 primary, it was striking. The very first thing Biden did, having campaigned as being the anti-Bernie Sanders, immediately turned to Bernie Sanders and said, I'm going to run on your agenda. And they put together this task force, and the things that came out of that were really, really aggressive and progressive. Everyone should have seen this coming if they won control of Congress. Some of us did warn about that and the stakes of that Senate election, but it didn't resonate with enough Republicans to help the GOP maintain control and be able to put up that stop sign. I bring this up because it's very much going to be hanging over this convention this week, too. Kamala Harris, there's such an obvious agenda, so many obvious things she could be doing to help her campaign. She's not doing it for the same reason, is that she is so focused on courting that progressive left and presenting this facade of unity in the party. And because the progressive left will stomp its feet at anything less than 100% of what it gets, that means by design, the platform and her statements and her policy agenda all swing toward that way. In a way, it's the same problem Joe Biden had, what hurt his presidency. And this is going to be the potential blockage against her winning the presidency, too, if anything is.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Also speaking today, according to the DNC schedule, is Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. And Colin, let's dig into his record a little bit, because one of the things that is notable about having the Democratic convention in Chicago is that Chicago is a Democratic city, a progressive city, hasn't had a Republican mayor in almost a century. And so this is a city that is run by the party that wants to take these policies national. And yet, I don't think there are a lot of people, certainly none on the right side of the political spectrum, but I think also few on the left, who would say that Chicago is a well-run city, that this is a model of the kind of governance that the rest of the country should follow. So it is interesting having these delegates here talking about their party platform and what they want to do in a city that seems in many ways like it is not working.
That's right, for sure. I mean, there's no question that Chicago is a showcase for progressive governance. And I think it's particularly useful at this moment when there's this battle that Kim was just discussing within the Democratic Party over how far left it wants to go to appease this very vocal protest element that's, we've really seen emerge over the past year. And what you really get to see here in Chicago is what things look like if Democrats get to have full control and shape the agenda from the get-go. Taxes are very high here. Public unions are powerful and entitled and extremely demanding. They generally run the show. Crime continues to be a major stabilizing problem, largely because the city's ambivalence toward actually sort of letting the Chicago Police Department do its job. In recent years, Chicago has changed some of its policies to rein in police actions because they're worried about police violence or confrontations. But the outcome has been that when, for instance, you don't let police pursue criminals on foot, or you discourage the police from going after carjackers, those kinds of mid-level violent crimes that active policing can actively address really begin to flourish in those brackets, and particularly in marginal neighborhoods. And so Mayor Johnson is going to try to boast this week that the murder rate is falling in Chicago, but that's actually a problem for him because the murder rate's falling across the country, but it's falling much less in Chicago. The city has really been the worst of that for a long time, and it's not getting better. And that definitely affects the business climate here. Chicago's a beautiful city. It has an architecturally gorgeous downtown here along the Chicago River with all kinds of glossy skyscrapers and really a lot of beauty and potential from the years when the city was built as a Midwest urban hub. But you go a few blocks west and the reality is that the streets just don't really feel that safe at night. Crime's something that you can almost feel in the air here. Shoplifting's up. Carjackings are a problem, as I said. Armed robberies. So I think as the delegates are here looking around at all the things they want to do with their progressive policies, it really does bear looking at what's happened over the years in Chicago.
And those results that Colin is laying out seems like they ought to prompt a change in direction, but it seems like what is actually happening is a doubling down. So here's a recent news story, August 7, about how Mayor Brandon Johnson is talking about solving a problem of food deserts by offering a network of 3 city-owned grocery stores. It could cost upfront $26.7 million, according to a consultant's report, and apparently these would not be run by the city, that they would bring in some kind of private operator in order to run these grocery stores in communities that don't have a grocery store, where grocery stores have closed down. But the question that hits me is, why not just solve the problems that are driving out the retailers, national companies who make a living, a good business? They know how to run these stores. They know how to make a profit in them. If they have a business environment, a crime environment where that is possible. And Kim, Chicago and Illinois are also part of a sort of a public union ratchet where the unions are contributing to the politicians who are bargaining with the unions, the public unions, in order to give teacher raises and benefit raises and pension increases. And so it's almost like there's two sides on the same side of the table when they're making those kinds of decisions, which makes it really hard to break out of that spiral. It takes a serious voter revolt, I think.
Well, all these grand plans that Mayor Johnson has are hilarious because there's no money because of all the mistakes they have made so far. The city budget has a $538 million hole. By the way, the pension debt, $51 billion. And this is despite a city and a state that have one of the higher combined sales taxes out there, income taxes. There's all kinds of other fascinating little taxes in Chicago. There's a fountain drink tax and a parking tax and an amusement tax. And to your point, none of this resonates with the unions. Right now, literally, the Chicago Teachers Union is asking for annual 9% pay increases. This is a union, by the way, by some of the recent test scores, 21% of 8th graders in 2022 were proficient in reading in Chicago. They've already had money just throwing it at the schools, and it's made no difference. So we're seeing this model replicated across the country, too. It's not just in Chicago. California is having its own dramatic issues with budget holes after wanton spending and the failure of a number of its policies. You're seeing it in certain northeastern states. And of course, adding to all of this is people get tired of it and then they decide to vote with their feet and they get up and leave. And so you've had out migration from many of these areas to states where people feel like they can finally have reasonable tax rates, finally have schools that functionally work. And what we have generally seen is that absent absent voters just finally putting their foot down and demanding change, these cities and states remain on their course. And unfortunately, Chicago had that opportunity not so long ago with an election, but they elected Johnson, who was very much in keeping with and determined to maintain that progressive drift.
Colin, what's your sense of how ready Chicago is for any protests that might try to turn disruptive? There was a march yesterday, Sunday, one of the first marches through the Loop, 3.5 hours, according to ABC7, remained peaceful, sending a message on the eve of the DNC. But there have been concerns that some of those protesters, as we get further into the week, may not decide to be so peaceful, may not want to be so peaceful. And I've only been on the ground here for about a day, but I must say, just walking around in the downtown Loop area, I have seen some pretty good gaggles of serious-looking police officers. There's a pretty good presence.
There is, for sure. And I think, look, the Chicago Police Department is going to do their best. They're going to be out in force. They're bringing in reinforcements. I think there is still, though, nonetheless, a real danger here that the protests and the number of protesters coming in could end up really eclipsing the Democrats' message here this week. And I think as we talk about it, we also really need to talk about how that message is being managed at the top level by Mayor Johnson. I think he's been so eager to endear himself over the past week to these pro-Palestinian protesters and to sort of be embraced by that left wing of the Democratic Party, of which he considers himself a member, that he's been unwilling to really provide the right kind of leadership for this event. And what's even more interesting about it is that the protest groups that, like Behind Enemy Lines, are not at all embracing him. I saw a post where they were calling him a dangerous Zionist wolf in progressive sheep's clothing. So that's not exactly a ringing endorsement from them. And by the way, I think you also have to think about the DNC, as Kim was talking about the city budget, the DNC should be something like the Olympics from the perspective of a municipal budget, right? This should be a huge boost for the city's finances, and goodness knows the city can use some revenue, but I think because Mayor Johnson has failed to inspire confidence about his ability to maintain stability during the city, a lot of the city's businesses are telling their employees to work remotely during the convention. So, as you said, we're set up downtown here, right in the middle of this beautiful Chicago business district, and I'm here a lot. And today, on Monday morning, I have to say it's really unusually quiet out there. There's much less pedestrian traffic than usual, and I think that's certainly a reflection of how many companies have given their employees strong recommendations to work from home. So to the extent that the city would be hoping that the DNC would bring in additional revenue and dining and spending and all these people who are flowing into the city, some of that is counteracted by the fact that anyone working within a half-mile radius of the Israeli consulate is probably staying home.